Hey everybody, this is Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our series looking at Russian bias by looking at some of the anti-aircraft that have been added to Russia over the last few years. Now, Russian anti-air at the start of the era that we're going to be looking at over the course of this video was actually in a fairly poor shape. You could argue the BTR-152 was probably the best option all the way up into the ZSU-23-4 essentially. That being said, USA anti-air was also in a very similar shape in that if you weren't very good with the twin 40mm Bofors on the M19 or M42, you might as well use the M16 half-track all the way until you got to the M163 Vulcan. The beginning of the efforts to fix the Russian anti-aircraft tree charted in June of 2022 with the BTR-ZD in the Danger Zone update, the same update we got the F-14 Tomcat. The BTR-ZD is a fast, lightweight vehicle that also had two fast-firing and high-velocity 23mm cannons, and due to the fact that it had 6 crew, was actually somewhat difficult to take out in a single shot unless you had a round that could overpressure like Heat FS. On the whole, I think this vehicle was generally well accepted by the community at the time, although it did end up having to be nerfed and raised in battle rating because in terms of its ability to take on planes and helicopters, it was actually a little too good. It was very easy to use and could even threaten light vehicles fairly consistently. That being said, I was still generally on board with fixing some of Russia's anti-air woes at this point and was really waiting for the time when they would get to the US tech tree and the massive gap USA had at the time. When War Thunder released the Fire and Ice update in October of 2022, Russia got the 2S38 premium vehicle, and the 2S38 was kind of an odd bird. It never appeared on the test server, and there was never any indication that it was being added until the patch went live and everybody saw there was a brand new premium vehicle. The 2S38 is a fairly new vehicle and at the time was a very questionable addition, as the 2S38 was still undergoing trials and the main shell they were giving it, the APFS-DS round, was also questionably authentic as it was kind of unclear how many, if any, were really going to be produced. In addition to that, despite being an anti-air in real life, in the game it was classified as a light tank, which ended up being essentially a net benefit as anti-air don't have anywhere near as many of the special features as a light tank, and of course as a light tank they could freely give it full magazines of the somewhat questionable APFS-DS round as opposed to most other anti-airs that are stuck with only a single belt of dart or high velocity armor piercing rounds. Significantly, as one of the only premium vehicles that is capable of effectively engaging aircraft from the ground, it also gave the Russia premium grinding lineup a major leg up over contemporary grinding lineups, as you weren't as vulnerable to air if you didn't have anything in the tech tree around that battle rating as you were with, say, American or German grinding lineups. Ultimately, the 2S38 did get a minor nerf in terms of its BR adjustment, but honestly it probably should have gotten a more significant nerf, and the only reason it didn't is likely because it is a premium vehicle with one of the big three, and those tend to be a little under tiered simply because of how many people play them. In December of 2022 we got the Apex Predator patch, and along with that we got the Strela M10. The Strela M10 was Russia's first IR guided surface-to-air missile system, and it dropped in the game at a mere 9.3. This vehicle would ultimately have to be nerfed twice all the way up to its current battle rating of 10.3 because it turned out it had better range and generally better tracking than most contemporary IR systems, and they also added an option for a mixed IR and optical system later. The Strela ultimately ended up being one of the more effective IR systems in the entire game, second only to the Japanese Type 81. Significantly, the Apex Predator update also introduced aircraft like the F-16 and the Tornado, and these did steadily start to eat into the win rate of Russian teams at top tier, especially as the 2S6, while good, was struggling to keep up with the new NATO aircraft, and that was when we got the Sky Guardians update in March of 2023. Despite the generic name of Sky Guardians, the only sky really getting guarded in this update were Russian skies, as it featured two Russian anti-air. The first, the M53-59, is essentially a very similar vehicle to the BTR-ZD in terms of just fast-firing autocannons that also have a high muzzle velocity, and it was very easy to use against aircraft, but unlike the BTR-ZD, had much higher penetration and was much better against ground targets, even though it did have noticeably worse mobility. The M53-59 did ultimately get nerfed and raised in battle rating. The more significant vehicle with Sky Guardians, however, was the Pantsir S1 added to top-tier Russia. The Pantsir S1, both at the time and even largely today, is still head and shoulders above most contemporary anti-aircraft systems and stands as the preeminent top-tier anti-air system. It's also theoretically the best anti-air system you could really give Russia at this point. It features 4 fast-firing 30mm cannons that are very easy to use and very good against aircraft flying at low altitude, which gave it a pretty big advantage over contemporary systems that are entirely missile based. On top of that, it has not 2, not 8, but 12 ready to fire surface air missiles that have some of the best range in the entire game. It couples all of this with a highly effective radar and is one of the few top tier anti-airs in the entire game that can fire its long range missiles while moving. It also got all of the bells and whistles they were testing out with other anti-aircraft systems, such as the ability to track multiple targets and the semi-automatic lead feature. Now, before the Sky Guardians update, the Chinese tech tree had gotten the Tor M1, and it was actually mentioned by the developers that they were planning on adding it to the Russian tree at some point, so I think most players were under the impression that this was going to be the replacement for the 2S6, but they seem to have leapfrogged the Tor M1 entirely and gone straight to the Pantsir, which is very odd because the Tor M1 was a known quantity. They already knew it was good, but not necessarily overpowered, whereas the Pantsir was a much more open variable. Speaking of which, Sky Guardians was when the developers helpfully revealed that the 2S6 had been operating with characteristics for its missiles that they already knew were completely fake. So when Sky Guardians released, the 2S6 got nerfed to its quote-unquote authentic missiles and got moved down in battle rating to 10.7, effectively giving Russia a pseudo extra anti-air at a penultimate battle rating. At this point in the game's history, Russia had been the dominant force at top tier for about 2 years, and they could have nerfed Russia at any time by simply giving the 2S6 its authentic missile performance characteristics and opening Russian top tier up to more vulnerabilities from NATO aircraft, but they just didn't do it, and I honestly don't know why. I have no idea, and I have no explanation for why they kept the 2S6 with such obviously fake stats on its missile for so long. And of course, several people were quick to point out that, well, the 2S6 was getting nerfed, so obviously it wasn't Russian bias, but the 2S6 was only nerfed when they already had a replacement for it, so that doesn't necessarily say anything about Russian bias. If anything, it supports the idea that they wanted Russia to do well, even if it meant including blatantly inauthentic vehicles in the game. Ultimately, the Pantsir did single-handedly curb the win rate of NATO teams with their brand new strike aircraft, and there are several variables about adding anti-aircraft that we haven't really discussed that need to be looked at, and that is namely that the more effective a nation's anti-air is, the more freedom their aircraft have to not worry about other planes and only worry about threats from the ground. So adding the Pantsir didn't simply help Russians not get attacked by enemy aircraft, it also helped aircraft like the Ka-52 and the MiG-27K to be more effective because they weren't as worried about getting shot down by F-14s and F-16s. The Pantsir was overpowered, but as an 11.7 vehicle, you couldn't exactly raise its battle rating, so instead what the developers did was they raised its spawn cost to that of a light tank instead of the lower spawn cost of an anti-air, but this was a fairly weak fix, especially as most NATO nations don't really have an equivalent system that fits in a single vehicle to the Pantsir, and interestingly enough, prior to adding the Pantsir, the developers had mentioned the Israeli Spider system, but said they were reluctant to include it because they thought it might be too powerful, despite the fact that Israel makes up a relatively small percentage of the matchmaker, and even if the Spider was too powerful as a single anti-air for a minor nation, probably wouldn't have been that impactful. Moving on to the Kings of Battle update in October 2023, we had the BTR-152D added, which was essentially a BTR-152 with a few extra guns bolted to the mounting system, which was a reasonably effective anti-air, and ultimately up to this point hasn't really need to be nerfed, so it is at least the most balanced of the ones we've looked at so far. And the last vehicle we're going to look at for this video is the ZSU-234M4, which was dropped in the Alpha Strike patch of March of 2024, and coincidentally this dropped the exact update after the Strela had gotten moved up to 10.3. This was dropped at 9.3, so Russia went from losing a 9.3 to 9.7 AA to gaining a brand new one basically right away, which is just the kind of thing I can't help but laugh at because of how ridiculous it is. Meanwhile, 2 years later, if we pan the camera over to the American anti-air situation, it's exactly the same without a single vehicle being added between those battle ratings. America did receive some vehicles, but they were mostly a mixed bag. Things like the improved Chaparral, the XM975, and the Lavad mostly just hit a single BR and don't really spread the love across the entire range like Russia did. Now, ultimately, I'm not trying to say that if a nation has a gap or has a problem that it shouldn't be filled, although from a game design standpoint, leaving problems with certain factions can lead to more interesting play and counterplay relationships, as they have obvious weaknesses that can be exploited if they become too powerful. But taking the most robust tech tree in the game and filling its only weakness is a very questionable decision, especially as many of the vehicles they filled it with were overpowered and ended up having to be nerfed later. So while the developers have certainly approached problems problems in other nations' tech trees or with other nations' vehicle lines, they haven't really done so with such gusto as they did trying to address the problem with Russian AA, and at most VRs they have addressed this problem so thoroughly that Russia easily has some very decent, if not the most competitive AA at a respective battle rating. This is the type of thing that I have a hard time excusing away, as they have added so many effective AAs at so many battle ratings that it can't simply be an accident. It has to be some kind of intentional decision, while other nations get AAs in a much more piecemeal fashion and often at lower performance ratings than the Russian ones. When I was grinding through the Russian nation, I noticed there were over 100 vehicles and it could play at most battle ratings reasonably effectively, so it seemed like the candidate that you would want to buff up its weaknesses on the least, as there are other nations that could use a lot more help. Or to boil all this down in simpler terms, it's not that Russia got AA, it's that Russia got a lot of AA spread out across all the battle ratings that it didn't previously have them, and the ones they got were all very good, while most other nations got at best half-hearted attempts to fill in much smaller gaps. But of course, that's just my take on the whole Russian anti-air situation. What do you think? Do you agree, disagree? Do you think they went overboard? Do you think everything was fine? Let me know down in the comments down below. Obviously, if you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.